Hey there, Chris Brown here, part-time hobo in my finest duds today. Well, a while back I was talking about the town I grew up in, Green Bay, and what it was famous for. And there was some things I just couldn't quite remember, and now, well, I've suddenly realized what it is. Well, the booyah, that is famous, that the churches put out. Fish fries out in the countryside, the perch, the Friday night perch fries, and all the taverns out there by gum, and the Green Bay Packers. Of course, the Green Bay Packers. I mean, Green Bay wouldn't be on the map if it wasn't for Green Bay, or at least it would be just another town that you might have heard of. Okay, but otherwise, it's well known. People know, oh, Green Bay, you're home of the Packers. That generally is what comes up. But who are the Packers? What makes this small little town just embrace this team, the Green Bay Packers? What makes much of the country? How come there are fans all over the world that like the Green Bay Packers? What's that all about? Well, they are one of the smallest market teams of all the male professional sports in both America, United States and Canada. Green Bay is a town just over 100,000. There's very few towns like that. They're publicly owned, and talk about that in a minute because that means a little bit of different things. And they have a long, long history of being tied to a tough guy town, Green Bay. So, have to look back at where does football come from. Football came from really rugby, and then rugby morphed into football and was played on college campuses out east. And for, well, almost 100 years, football was a college sport. It was known as, when you thought of football, up until almost the 1960s, you considered college first and professional football second. Professional football really, professional sports were a much smaller entity. And in fact, all these small little towns around Wisconsin and the upper Midwest had their little football teams. But they would get maybe a little gate admission at times. They'd pass the hat, but they were far from anything we'd recognize as professional football today. Well, this was happening in Green Bay, and they had their own little teams and area throughout the area and all the little towns. And there was one guy by the name of Curly Lambeau, good athlete, gifted athlete. Went to Notre Dame for a year, but then got sick, tonsillitis, came back to Green Bay and wanted to be involved in sports. So he and another guy by the last name Whitney got sponsorship from the Indian Packing Company and started a team, the Indian Packers. Well, they struggled with the name at first, what to call them. They were originally going to call them maybe the Green Bay Indians, but somebody convinced them that they're a packing company, let's call them the Packers. And at first then they were called the Indian Packing Company sponsored team, but then Indian was sold to Acme and they were the Acme Packers, and then they became the Green Bay Packers. They were first organized or incorporated in 1919 and then joined the newly growing what was called the American Professional Football Association, with George Halas in Chicago and Curly Lambeau and a variety of others putting together what eventually is going to become the NFL. These were the early years, 1991 or 1921. And thus began not only that, but a rivalry with the Chicago team. The Chicago Cardinals, it was first, but then it became later on the Chicago Bears. And George Halas, Papa Bear Halas, took that for many, many decades, ran that team. But in Green Bay, it was Curly Lambeau. Curly was a player and coach throughout the 1920s, and then went on to be coach and general manager of the team for 2 more decades. So was with the Packers for almost 30 years and ushered them during the 1920s into the late 20s in championship teams in this newly growing NFL. And they played on the east side of Green Bay near East High School, where sometimes Curly Lambeau also coached, at what was called City Stadium. And they played there for many years, and it was a very fancy affair that when you went to the game, you dressed up, you wore your finest, you wore a suit, tie, a hat, and it was something you took pride in. My grandparents moved there in 1935, and they immediately took to the Green Bay Packers. They lived just blocks away from the City Stadium and often would go to games. And we have programs from the area. But the team suddenly in 1935, they got Don Hudson, they had a guy by Johnny Blood McNally, you had all these players that were bringing the team into becoming a real powerhouse. And not only that, Don Hudson is going to change the game. Football was primarily a running game. Running backs, halfbacks, fullbacks, quarterbacks. They ran the ball, passed once in a while, and Hudson's going to change that. And today we know football is a lot of different things, but pass is certainly a big part of the game. So the Packers take this and have great success up until about 1945-46. Hudson retires, the team's kind of aging. Lambeau's been with the team, there's been for 25, almost 30 years, and there's some grumbling going on, and the Packers are losing money. They built a new lodge out north of Green Bay, out near the town of Dykesville, and had a practice facility there that the players hated. It was hard. The limestone of the thumb of Door County was killing them, and so they were in tough shape. Well, in 1949, to make some money, they went on a public stock exchange, and for 25 bucks, got you a 1 share of the Packers. What does that 1 share get you? Well, here is one of those original shares. That share got you voting rights for the board of directors on the Packers. Packers were organized as a nonprofit that was owned by the community or the shareholders. However, the shares are worthless. And it stipulates, if sold, stock will go to the Sullivan Wallen Post Number 11 of the American Legion for the purpose of creating a soldier's memorial. Okay, and that actually goes back to World War I, when the first sponsorship of the Packers came along, wanting to build a soldier's memorial. And you'll notice many old stadiums were called Memorial Stadium. However, they sold a share to the Packers. Packers went into the 1950s, kind of a hurting team. Lambeau leaves, he goes to coach in Washington, and the Packers have 1950s a big struggle. In fact, it's why they're going to go under, and suddenly in 1956 they draft a new quarterback, 17th round, Bart Starr from Alabama, a few other players, Paul Hornung from Notre Dame, and then they hire an assistant coach by the name of Vince Lombardi from the New York Giants. At the same time, the NFL is growing, and they hire a new commissioner by the name of Pete Rozelle. Rozelle sees the power of television and begins to craft television contracts that are very lucrative. Suddenly the shift is happening. Professional football is gaining momentum as becoming the sport. And eventually it's going to take on baseball, which was the sport. So the Packers head into the 1960s and they start to win. And they're beating their rival Bears. And then they're going further and further. Then in the Ice Bowl, they play the Dallas Cowboys. And Bart Starr makes that famous quarterback sneak. And they win that game in 13 below zero weather. And then they go on and they win Super Bowl I and Super Bowl II. And they become this mythic legend. And what has Green Bay become? Titletown, USA. And it's all playing out on in people's living rooms on Sunday afternoon. Now, the first Super Bowl only attracted 33,000 people. played in Pasadena, a stadium that could hold about 100,000. So, you know, it was still yet to grow. Packers also had one other thing going for them. They had a new stadium. They built the new stadium in the 1950s, 1957, when things were looking a little rough and the threat was coming whether they were going to move the team to Milwaukee. Milwaukee's a much bigger city, much bigger market than little old Green Bay. Green Bay coughed it up and they built a new 32,000 seat stadium on the west side out in Ashwaubenon. And this became the new county stadium, and it was opened by Richard Nixon in 1957, and it just became what is what in 1965, after Curly Lambeau passed away, they named it Lambeau Field, and it's still Lambeau Field today and will remain Lambeau Field. I can't imagine it ever getting people allowing it to be called anything but that. That is right. So the Packers are heading into they finish off the 1960s. Lombardi, he heads out to go to Washington. Bart Starr eventually retires, goes on to coach and doesn't do so well with that. 70s and 80s, it's kind of rough on the Packers. And they go through a couple of player coaches during that time, but have not so much success. And again, by the 1980s, towards the end, rumblings are they going to make it? Are they going to continue to be able to carry on in Green Bay? There were some scandals here and there, and then all of a sudden, new management comes in. They get Ron Wolf, and they get Bob Harlan. They hire Mike Holmgren as coach. They scope out this weird kid down in Atlanta by the name of Brett Favre, and bang, off they go. A couple of years later, they hire a guy from the Philadelphia Eagles by the name of Reggie White, who was instrumental in putting together the really the free agency system that allows players to get paid a lot of money. Because remember, probably up until the 1970s, players, they worked two jobs. They did not make the kind of money they did. In the 1960s, the players that played for the Green Bay Packers, most of them were selling insurance or doing other things at that time. So the 1990s are kind to the Packers. Very kind. They win a Super Bowl in 1997. They play in another Super Bowl in 1998. And they're going to capitalize, the management is going to capitalize on this energy the Packers have recaptured, and they have a new stock exchange. This time, though, it's one share is 200, and the previous owners of shares was split. And if you had one share, now it was worth 1,000. My mother's one share that had been passed on to her from her grandma was now worth 1,000 shares. And the only way that you can continue to pass that on is through bloodline, though some of the shares. And so now when my parents passed away, I have 100 shares. My son has 100 shares, and it's spread out throughout our family. And every summer we get to vote. I get 100 votes. My son gets 100 votes for who sits on the Packer Board of Directors. So that 1997 helped rebuild Lambeau. Lambeau is since now sits, it went originally from 32,000 to now it seats 72,000, I believe, a much greater number. Packers have been wildly successful for 30 years, have had only 2 quarterbacks, have played in 3 Super Bowls and won 2 of them, and been very close many times that have made many a Green Bay fan just lose their mind. You get so close for many times and then not quite get there. But that is the Green Bay Packers. That's what put them on the map, that keeps them there today. You can go almost anywhere, on any old train, anywhere you go, somebody's going to say, Packers, yeah. You look back and you say, go Pack. All right. That's the story of the Packers and what put Green Bay on the map. This old hobo's got to hit the road, so have a great day.